At 16:45 hours on March 5, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks stood on the deck of USS Attic at Portsmouth Navy Yard in Kittery, Maine, taking command of a ship that had no business going to war. Hicks was a career Navy officer from South Carolina, Naval Academy graduate class of 1928. By 1942, he had served on destroyers and cruisers. He knew gunnery, he knew tactics. The ship was USS Attic, hull number AK-101, a 30-year-old rust-bucket cargo steamer that looked exactly like what it was, a slow, defenseless merchant vessel. But USS Attic was carrying weapons that could sink a German submarine. 4 4-inch naval guns hidden behind fake panels. 8 machine guns concealed in false deckhouses. 6 depth charge projectors disguised as cargo equipment. The holds were packed with pulpwood to keep her afloat after torpedo hits. On paper, USS Attic was a merchant ship named SS Vilfranca, Portuguese, a registry, sailing alone through U-boat-infested waters. In reality, she was America's most secret weapon, a Q ship, a floating trap designed to lure German submarines to the surface and destroy them at close range. Project LQ was born from desperation. On January 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt suggested to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, that deploying Q ships might help combat the U-boat menace. Admiral King, with some misgivings, perceived this as a directive and immediately took action. 5 civilian vessels were secretly converted to Navy warships at Portsmouth Navy Yard. No press releases. No official records in standard Navy files. $500,000 was allocated from an emergency fund, so expenditures would not be directly accountable through normal Navy requisition procedures. All written records were kept in a secret file in the sole custody of the Chief of Naval Operations. The program existed because German U-boats were destroying American ships faster than America could build them. By January 12, 1942, British intelligence had noted a heavy concentration of U-boats off the North American seaboard from New York to Cape Race. They passed that information to the United States Navy. That same day, Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan in U-123 torpedoed and sank the British steamship Cyclops 350 miles southeast of Cape Sable, Nova Scotia. 98 people died. Operation Drumbeat had begun. Over the next 6 weeks, German submarines sank ship after ship in plain sight of American beaches. Tankers exploded and burned while people watched from shore. Freighters went down within sight of lighthouses. Oil slicks and wreckage washed up on tourist beaches. The U-boat commanders called it the second happy time. American coastal cities refused to implement blackouts because they feared it would hurt tourism. Navigation lights stayed on. Ships sailed alone, fully lit, following predictable routes. For German submarine commanders, it was target practice. Between January and March 1942, U-boats sank 137 Allied ships in American waters. Over 650,000 tons of shipping, 3 million gallons of fuel oil, vital supplies, food, weapons, ammunition, all gone to the bottom. American destroyers and patrol aircraft were tied up in convoy duty in the North Atlantic. The eastern seaboard had almost no defense. Someone had to do something. Navy shipyard workers at Portsmouth spent 3 weeks converting Attic and her sister ship Asterion. They cut openings in the deck for concealed guns. They installed hydraulic panels that dropped away in seconds to reveal the weapons. They reinforced the bulkheads to handle recoil from 4-inch naval artillery. They ran ammunition hoists from the holds to the gun positions. They disguised everything to look like normal cargo equipment. The work took 3 weeks. Rush job. The chief of the Bureau of Ships wanted both Attic and her sister ship Asterion converted and ready by March 1, 1942. They made the deadline, barely. But the ships were not ready for combat. Attic was a 30-year-old civilian steamer built in 1912. Single screw, steam engine, top speed 9 knots. The armour was non-existent. The guns were concealed but relatively light. The crew had 3 weeks of training. Most had never been in combat. The plan was simple in theory. Atik would sail alone through known U-boat hunting grounds. She would look like an easy target, a slow merchant ship, no escort, no defense. When a U-boat spotted her, the submarine would surface to save torpedoes and sink her with deck guns. That was German doctrine. Torpedoes were expensive. A slow cargo ship was not worth wasting torpedoes. German commanders would surface, approach to short range, use their deck gun to finish off the victim. That was when Atik would drop her panels, reveal her guns, and open fire at point-blank range. Supporting destroyers were supposed to be nearby to help finish off the U-boat once it was damaged. That was the theory. The first Q-ship lost was a fishing trawler named Eagle. She went on patrol in February 1942 under the command of Lieutenant Commander Leonard Roscoe. The Navy had acquired the Boston beam trawler MS Wave and briefly designated her as Auxiliary Minesweeper USS Eagle, number AM-132, before reclassifying her as USS Captor, number PYC-40, for Q-ship duty. Eagle was the smallest of the 5 Q ships, displacing only about 300 tons. Her small size was supposed to be an advantage. German submarines might consider her too insignificant to waste a torpedo, preferring to surface and sink her with gunfire, but Eagle found nothing. She patrolled the shipping lanes off the New England coast for 2 weeks in February. Saw no U-boats. Encountered no targets. Returned to port with engine problems. The Navy sent her out again in March. Same result. No contact, no U-boats. Mechanical failures plagued the aging vessel. By April, the Navy had given up on Eagle as a Q-ship. She was reassigned to patrol duty and served out the war in less glamorous roles. The second attempt was USS Asterion, Atik's twin sister. Commander George Walter Legwin took command. Asterion was identical to Atik in almost every respect. Built in 1912. Same armament. Same disguised weapon systems. Same pulpwood cargo. She was commissioned on February 27, 1942, just 1 week before Atik. Asterion and Atik sailed together on March 23rd, departing Portsmouth on what was supposed to be a shakedown cruise, but quickly became an active combat patrol. The 2 ships were ordered to navigate so that one would be approximately 480 miles south of the other after 5 days at sea. This dispersal was intended to maximize coverage of the coastal shipping lanes while maintaining some degree of mutual support. In reality, 480 miles was far too distant for effective mutual support. If one ship got in trouble, the other could not possibly arrive in time to help. On the night of March 26th, Asterion was cruising approximately 240 miles south of Atik's position. At approximately 20:45 hours Eastern Wartime, Asterion's radio operator picked up faint distress signals. SOS, ship torpedoed. The signals were broken, fragmentary, difficult to read. Asterion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Legwin, immediately ordered a course change toward the source of the transmission. But the position was uncertain. The signals had been weak and intermittent. Asterion steamed north through the night, searching. At first light on March 27th, lookouts scanned the horizon. They saw nothing. No ships. No wreckage. No survivors. No U-boats. The ocean was empty. Asterion continued searching throughout the day, covering a grid pattern around the estimated position of the distress call. At 1400 hours, they found debris, small pieces of wood, cork floats, an empty life jacket, oil slicks. The wreckage was scattered over several square miles. There was no way to identify what ship it had come from. It could have been any of dozens of vessels sunk in recent weeks. Asterion searched until dark. Found nothing else. Legwin faced a decision. Continue searching or resume his assigned patrol. He chose to resume patrol. Asterion was supposed to be hunting U-boats, not conducting search and rescue operations. Other ships could handle that mission. Legwin took Asterion back to her assigned area and continued the Q-ship mission for another 4 days. She saw no U-boats, encountered no targets. On March 31st, Asterion received orders to return to port. The Navy was starting to realize that Project LQ was not working. Back in Portsmouth, Legwin filed his patrol report. He mentioned the distress call and the wreckage. Intelligence officers compared his report with other information. They concluded that the distress call had probably come from USS Attic. Asterion had been the closest ship to Attic when she was attacked, but Asterion had been too far away to help. By the time she reached the area, Attic had been gone for 12 hours. The wreckage Asterion found might have been from Attic, or it might have been from one of the other ships sunk that week. There was no way to know for certain. The third ship in Project LQ was USS Big Horn, a tanker converted to look like a civilian oiler. She sailed in April 1942 under the command of a Navy captain. Big Horn spent 6 weeks at sea, no U-boat contacts. She returned to port in May with nothing to report. The program was failing, not because the Q ships were ineffective, but because U-boats were learning to be cautious. German submarine commanders had fought British Q ships in World War I. They knew the tactic. They knew that some merchant ships were armed. By March 1942, German intelligence had warned all U-boat commanders to be wary of suspicious-looking cargo vessels sailing alone in convoy routes. Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks knew the odds. He had been briefed on the program. He knew that British Q ships in World War I had mixed success at best. He knew that Project LQ was experimental. He knew that 4 previous Q ship patrols had produced 0 U-boat kills. He knew that Attic was slow, barely armed, and vulnerable. But Hicks believed in the mission. Hicks was born in Kentucky, grew up in a small town, joined the Navy in 1926. He worked his way up through the enlisted ranks before attending officer candidate school. He served on destroyers and cruisers. He knew gunnery. He knew tactics. He had trained his crew for 3 weeks on how to operate the concealed weapons, how to drop the panels, how to aim under combat conditions, how to stay hidden until the last possible moment. The crew of USS Attic consisted of 141 men, officers, petty officers, gunners, engine room crew, deck hands. Most were in their 20s, some were teenagers, a few were in their 30s. They came from every part of America, farm towns, industrial cities, coastal communities. Some had been in the Navy for years, others had enlisted after Pearl Harbor. They all knew they were sailing into danger. On the morning of March 23, 1942, Attic cast off from Portsmouth Navy Yard at 1300 hours. The weather was clear, cold, north wind. Attic looked exactly like an old cargo steamer, rust streaks on the hull, faded paint, no visible weapons, no Navy markings. She flew no flag, just another merchant ship heading out to sea. Shipyard workers watched from the dock as Attic disappeared beyond the harbour breakwater. All anyone could do was wait. The Fiam/Slashens Arado. Engagement happened on the night of March 26, 1942. Attic was cruising alone 300 miles east of Norfolk, Virginia. The sea was moderate, overcast sky, limited visibility. At 1700 hours, a lookout on U-123 spotted smoke on the horizon. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan was on his second patrol off the American coast. He had already sunk 9 ships on this mission. His crew was experienced. They had been hunting for 3 weeks. They knew what to look for. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardigan was 29 years old in 1942. Born March 18, 1913, he had originally trained as a naval aviator before injuries from a crash brought him to the U-boat service in November 1939. He took command of U-123 in May 1941. By March 1942, he was on his second patrol to American waters, and he had already proven himself as one of Germany's most effective submarine commanders. On December 23, 1941, U-123 had departed Lorient, France, as part of Operation Drumbeat. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had selected only 5 Type 1X long-range submarines for the first wave of attacks against the American coast. U-123, U-130, U-66, U-125, and U-109. These boats had the range to cross the Atlantic, operate for weeks off the American seaboard, and return to France. Most German U-boats could not make that journey. The Type YX boats were larger, had more fuel capacity, and could carry more torpedoes than the standard Type 5-1 submarines that operated in the North Atlantic. Hardigan's mission was to penetrate close to New York Harbor and sink as much shipping as possible. On January 12, 1942, he sank the British freighter Cyclops off Nova Scotia, inaugurating Operation Drumbeat ahead of schedule. Over the next 3 weeks, he moved south along the American coast, sinking ship after ship. Tankers, freighters, cargo vessels. Most were sailing alone, fully lit, following predictable routes. American coastal cities refused to implement blackouts. Navigation lights remained on. For U-boat commanders, it was almost too easy. Hardigan later wrote in his patrol log that it was unbelievable how unprepared the Americans were. The entire coastline was lit up like a carnival. Ships were silhouetted against the glow of coastal cities. On his first patrol, Hardigan sank 9 ships totaling 53,000 tons. He returned to Lorient on February 9, 1942, and was awarded the Knight's Cross. After refitting and resupply, U-123 departed on March 24 for a second patrol. Hardigan's orders were the same. Hunt American shipping. Sink everything possible. Conserve torpedoes when feasible by using the deck gun on smaller, defenseless targets. Return when ammunition or fuel ran low. When U-123's lookout spotted Attique on the evening of March 26th, Hardigan studied the target through his binoculars. Old cargo steamer. Single funnel. Slow speed. No escort. No defensive armament visible. Exactly the kind of ship that was not worth wasting a torpedo. Hardigan decided to shadow the target until conditions were optimal, then surface and attack. Standard procedure. Save the torpedoes for more valuable targets. U-123 followed Attique for hours, staying submerged, staying out of sight. Watching. Waiting. At 1937 hours, Hardigan gave the order. U-123 surfaced. The submarine moved to firing position, range 700 yards. Hardigan fired one G7E torpedo. The torpedo struck Attique on the port side under the bridge. The explosion was massive. Fire erupted from the cargo holds. The ship listed slightly to port. Men could be seen running on deck. A lifeboat was lowered on the starboard side. It looked like a normal merchant ship, taking a torpedo hit. Crew abandoning ship. No weapons, no defense. Just another victim. Hardigan moved U-123 around Attique's stern to finish the job. That was when Hicks gave the order. The hydraulic panels dropped. The 4-inch guns swung into position. 8 machine guns opened fire. The first 4-inch shell landed short of U-123, sending up a massive splash. The second shell was off in deflection. The third missed high. The machine gun fire raked the submarine's conning tower. One round struck Farnrik zur See Holzer, a midshipman standing watch on the bridge. He went down with a chest wound. Hardigan reacted instantly. Full throttle. Emergency dive procedures. U-123's diesel engines poured out black smoke as the submarine accelerated away from Attique. The gunners kept firing, but the target was moving fast and presenting a narrow profile. The shells missed. U-123 submerged before Attique could land a killing shot. Hardigan had been incredibly lucky. He had come within seconds of being destroyed. His submarine had taken machine gun fire. One of his crew was dying, but the boat was intact. He could still fight. U-123 circled underwater and approached Attique from a different angle. At 21:29 hours, Hardigan fired a second torpedo. This one hit Attique's engine room. The explosion destroyed the boilers. Steam and smoke poured from the hull. The single propeller stopped turning. Attique was dead in the water. Bow settling. Stern rising. The crew was abandoning ship in earnest now. Lifeboats in the water. Men jumping overboard. Hardigan surfaced at 03:27 hours to watch a teak sink. The ship was still afloat, stubborn, refusing to go down. The pulpwood cargo was keeping her buoyant despite the torpedo damage. At 22:50 hours, something inside Attic detonated. The ship exploded, a massive blast that lit up the night sky. Debris flew hundreds of feet into the air. When the flames cleared, USS Attic was gone. Nothing remained but wreckage and oil. 141 men dead, the entire crew, no survivors. The lifeboats had been in the water, but a severe gale blew in immediately after the explosion. The storms had killed anyone who survived the blast. Hardigan buried Fahnrich zur See Rudi Holzer at sea 10 minutes later. 1 German casualty, 141 American casualties. U-123 left the area and continued hunting. The first search aircraft arrived at Attic's last reported position at 0800 hours on March 27th, a U.S. Army Air Corps bomber from the 1st Bomber Command. The pilot flew a grid pattern for 4 hours. He found nothing. No wreckage, no survivors, no oil slick. The storm had scattered everything across miles of ocean. The visibility was poor. White caps made it nearly impossible to spot debris. USS Noah, a Clemson-class destroyer commissioned in 1918, steamed to the site under the command of Lieutenant Commander Harold Grow Ford. Noah was one of the few destroyers available on the eastern seaboard. Most had been assigned to convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic. Noah searched for 12 hours, methodically covering the area where Attic had transmitted her distress signals. The crew spotted small pieces of debris, life jackets, wooden planks, cork floats. Nothing that could definitively be identified as coming from USS Attic. The ship had simply disintegrated. USS Sagamore, a fleet tug designated AT-20, attempted to reach the area but was forced back by heavy seas. The Atlantic was notoriously dangerous in late March. Storm systems moved through regularly. Wind speeds exceeded 40 knots. Waves ran 15 to 20 feet. Small vessels like tugs could not operate safely in those conditions. On March 30th, 3 days after the sinking, patrol aircraft found 5 empty lifeboats drifting approximately 80 miles south of the attack site. The boats had been blown off course by the gale. They were empty. No bodies, no supplies. No indication of what had happened to the men who had launched them. The lifeboats were marked with USS Attic's identification numbers. That was the only physical evidence ever recovered. The 141 men were simply gone, swallowed by the Atlantic. What nobody in the US Navy realized at the time was that the Germans knew exactly what had happened. On April 9, 1942, Radio Berlin broadcast a message. The High Command said today that a Q-boat of 3,000 tons was sunk by a torpedo after a battle fought partly on the surface with artillery and partly beneath the water with bombs and torpedoes. The Germans knew about Project LQ. They knew the Americans were using Q ships. They knew USS Attic was not a merchant vessel. German intelligence had been tracking the program. U-boat commanders received warnings to watch for armed merchant ships operating alone. The element of surprise was gone. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, was furious. Project LQ had been his response to Roosevelt's suggestion to use Q ships. The program had cost $500,000, 5 ships converted, months of training, complete operational security. And it had produced 0 U-boat kills. Worse, USS Attic had been sunk on her first patrol with all hands. The Germans had broadcast the kill to the world. The program was exposed. King ordered an immediate review. The review was brutal. Q ships were too slow to chase U-boats, too lightly armed to fight surface engagements, too vulnerable to torpedoes. The crews had inadequate training. The doctrine was flawed. German U-boat commanders were too experienced to fall for the trap. Supporting forces were too far away to help when Q ships got in trouble. The whole program was a waste of resources. King ordered all Q ship patrols suspended. USS Asterion was recalled from patrol in April 1942. USS Bighorn completed one more patrol in May and was reassigned to cargo duty. USS Eagle was decommissioned. USS Captor was sent to the Pacific, where she served as a patrol vessel but never engaged an enemy submarine. The only Q ship that saw any real action was USS Anacapa in the Pacific, and she almost sank 2 American submarines by accident when they entered her patrol area without proper identification. By August 1942, Project LQ was over. Then the Germans started noticing something strange. In May 1942, U-boat losses began to increase. 3 submarines were sunk in American waters. In June, 5 more went down. In July, 7 submarines were destroyed. The kills were not from Q ships. They were from destroyer escorts, patrol aircraft, and improved convoy tactics. The United States Navy had learned. Convoys were organized. Air coverage was extended. New radar systems were deployed. Depth charges were improved. Destroyer escorts were built specifically for anti-submarine warfare. The tactics that worked were not Q ships. They were coordinated air and sea patrols with proper equipment and training. By September 1942, German submarine operations off the American coast became too dangerous. U-boat commanders were ordered to focus on mid-Atlantic convoy routes where American defenses were weaker. Operation Drumbeat was over. The second happy time had ended. Between January and August 1942, the entire German U-boat campaign in Operation Drumbeat sank 397 Allied ships in American waters, over 2 million tons of shipping. Approximately 5,000 merchant sailors killed. Cargo worth hundreds of millions of dollars lost. Reinhard Hardigan himself was credited with sinking 22 ships totaling 114,000 tons across his entire career. But the rate of sinking was dropping. American shipyards were building Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The convoy system was working. Air patrols were effective. Radar was finding submarines before they could attack. Kapitanleutnant Reinhard Hardigan returned to Lorient on May 2, 1942. He had completed 2 patrols during Operation Drumbeat. He sank 19 ships totaling 90,000 tons across both patrols combined. He received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, Germany's highest military decoration. Adolf Hitler personally awarded him the medal at his headquarters in East Prussia. Photographs from that meeting show Hardigan, pale and thin after weeks at sea, standing at attention while Hitler pinned the oak leaves to his uniform. But Hardigan was done with combat patrols. The physical and psychological strain of submarine warfare had taken its toll. On July 31, 1942, he relinquished command of U-123. He was assigned to training duty, first with the 27th U-boat training flotilla in Gotenhafen, then as chief of U-boat training at the torpedo school at Marine Schule Mervik. Later in the war, he worked in the torpedo weapon department, overseeing testing and development of new acoustic and wire-guided torpedoes. In the final months of the war, he served as a battalion commander in Marine Infantry Regiment 6, fighting against British forces in the area around Bremen. Most of the officers in that unit were killed. Hardigan survived only because he was hospitalized with a severe case of diphtheria in the last days before German surrender. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, British troops arrested Hardigan. He spent 18 months as a prisoner of war before being released in late 1946. He returned to Bremen and started an oil trading business. The business was successful. Hardigan became wealthy. He served on Bremen's city council for 32 years, from 1952 to 1984, representing the Christian Democratic Union Party. He was active in veterans' affairs and maintained contact with other former U-boat commanders. In interviews later in life, Hardigan was careful about how he discussed the war. He said he was not a Nazi. He did his duty for his country, not for Hitler. He stated that by 1942, he and his crew had realized Hitler was a madman driving Germany toward catastrophe. He expressed skepticism about some aspects of Nazi atrocities, though historians note he was secluded at training bases and never served on the Eastern Front where the worst crimes were committed. When asked about the merchant sailors he had killed, Hardigan maintained that he had tried to help survivors when possible. He claimed he provided food and navigation directions to lifeboats. He ordered neutral ships to pick up survivors. He believed in fighting honorably even in submarine warfare. Historical records partially support these claims. Survivors from several ships Hardigan sank reported that the U-boat surfaced and the commander directed them toward the nearest land or shipping lanes. In at least one documented case, Hardigan forcibly stopped a neutral ship and ordered it to rescue survivors from a tanker he had just sunk. But other survivors reported no such assistance. The reality was complex. Submarine commanders had to balance humanitarian impulses against their own survival. Stopping to help survivors exposed the submarine to counterattack. Spending time on the surface in hostile waters was extremely dangerous. Most commanders, including Hardigan, helped when they could do so safely. When they could not, they left survivors to their fate. Hardigan never mentioned USS Attique, specifically in his memoirs or interviews. The engagement lasted only a few hours. To him, it was just another merchant ship, just another target. He did not realize Attic was a Q ship until German radio broadcast the news on April 9th. Even then, it did not register as particularly significant. He had survived. His boat had survived. He sank the enemy vessel. Mission accomplished. Move on to the next target. The fact that 141 American sailors died in that encounter apparently did not trouble him. They were the enemy. They were trying to kill him. He succeeded. They failed. That was war. Hardigan lived to be 105 years old. He died on June 9, 2018, in Bremen, Germany. He was the last surviving U-boat ace from Operation Drumbeat. German newspapers published lengthy obituaries. They called him a naval hero. They praised his courage and skill. They noted his post-war civilian service. Most obituaries briefly mentioned that he had sunk 22 ships during the war. A few mentioned USS Attic specifically as the only American Q ship sunk in World War II. None mentioned the 141 men who died when Attic exploded. For administrative purposes, Rear Admiral Russell Wilson wrote in a memorandum on July 2, 1942, the ship should be considered lost on March 27, 1942. He added that aside from notifications already made to dependents, no further publicity would be given to the loss of this ship. USS Attic was classified. The mission was secret. The loss was not announced publicly. The families of the crew members received telegrams. Missing in action. Lost at sea. No details provided. No explanation given. Official death notifications were not sent to families until April 5, 1944, more than 2 years after the sinking. The Navy did not officially acknowledge that USS Attic existed until after the war ended. When German records were translated, they revealed the full story. U-123 had engaged and sunk an American Q ship on March 27, 1942. The submarine had been lured into a surface engagement. The Q ship had opened fire and almost destroyed the U-boat, but the submarine escaped and came back to finish the job. 140. 1 Americans died. 1 German died. The battle lasted approximately 3 hours. The official U.S. Navy history of Project LQ was written after the war based on records maintained in secret files by the Chief of Naval Operations during the conflict. The assessment was honest. The Q ship program was a failure. The concept was flawed. The execution was poor. The results were non-existent. 0 U-boats sunk. 1 Q ship lost with all hands. Millions of dollars wasted. The analysis recommended that Q ship tactics should never be used again. Modern submarines were too fast and too well armed. Surface ships could not compete. The only effective anti-submarine weapons were aircraft, destroyers with sonar and depth charges, and convoy escorts. Q ships belonged to World War I. They had no place in modern naval warfare. The fundamental problem was that Q ships required submarines to surface and close to gun range. That tactic had worked in World War I when submarines had limited battery and capacity and spent most of their time on the surface. But by World War II, Submarines had better diesel engines, larger batteries, and could remain submerged for extended periods. More importantly, German submarine commanders had studied British Q-ship tactics from the previous war. They knew the signs to look for: a ship sailing alone in dangerous waters, no escorts, suspiciously good condition for a supposedly civilian vessel, crew that seemed too disciplined, unusual handling characteristics. German standing orders by 1942 explicitly warned commanders to be cautious of potential Q ships. When in doubt, attack from maximum range with torpedoes. Do not surface. Do not close to gun range. Do not give the enemy a chance to surprise you. Hardigan had violated those standing orders when he engaged Attic. He surfaced. He closed to 700 yards. He planned to use his deck gun, and he nearly paid for that decision with his life and his boat. The fact that Attic damaged U-123 and killed one crewman proved the Q-ship concept could work, at least in theory. But one damaged submarine was not worth the loss of 141 trained sailors and an entire ship. The mathematics were brutal. Project LQ consumed resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere. The 5 ships required crews totaling over 500 men. Those sailors could have manned destroyer escorts or patrol craft. The 5 ships required fuel, ammunition, supplies, maintenance, and port facilities. All of those resources were desperately needed for other purposes in early 1942. The $500,000 spent on Project LQ could have funded other anti-submarine programs, improved depth charges, better sonar equipment, additional patrol aircraft, training for escort crews. Any of those investments would have produced better results than Q ships. Lieutenant Commander Harry Linwood Hicks was never found. His body was not recovered. None of the crew were recovered. The explosion that destroyed USS Attic left nothing behind. No remains, no personal effects, just wreckage scattered across miles of ocean. The Navy listed Hicks and his entire crew as killed in action on March 27, 1942. They are commemorated on the tablets of the missing at various military cemeteries. Their names are carved in stone, but they have no graves. They rest somewhere on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles east of Norfolk, Virginia. The exact location of the wreck is unknown. In 1990, author Michael Gannon published Operation Drumbeat, a comprehensive history of the German U-boat campaign off the American coast. Gannon spent years researching German and American records. He interviewed Reinhard Hardigan extensively. He studied the logs of U-123. He analyzed the tactics used during Operation Drumbeat. In his book, Gannon devoted significant attention to USS Attic and Project LQ. He called it one of the most misguided programs of the war, a waste of ships and lives, a desperate response to a crisis that required better solutions. Gannon estimated that the resources spent on Project LQ could have built 2 destroyer escorts, which would have been far more effective at hunting U-boats. He noted that the 141 men who died on USS Attic were trained sailors who could have served on other vessels where they might have survived and contributed to the war effort. Gannon concluded that Project LQ was a perfect example of how desperation can lead to poor decisions. The program was created because President Roosevelt wanted a quick solution to the U-boat crisis. Admiral King implemented it because he felt pressured to act. The Navy converted 5 ships because there was political pressure to do something, anything, to stop the U-boats. But nobody stopped to ask whether Q ships would actually work in modern naval warfare. Nobody questioned whether the tactics that barely worked in World War I would be effective against experienced U-boat commanders in 1942. Nobody calculated whether the risks were worth the potential rewards. The program was doomed from the start. USS Attic and her crew paid the price for that failure. The wreck of USS Attic has never been found. The ocean is deep where she went down. The currents are strong. Wreckage from World War II ships is scattered all along the Atlantic coast. Fishing boats sometimes bring up pieces of metal, but identifying the source is almost impossible. USS Attic could be anywhere in a 100-square-mile area. She could be in one piece or scattered in fragments. The pulpwood cargo might have disintegrated decades ago. The guns might be buried in sand. The hull might be covered in marine growth. Nobody knows. Nobody is looking. There are too many wrecks, too much ocean, too few resources. USS Atik is just one more casualty of a war that happened 80 years ago. That is, how failure happens in war. Not through incompetence or cowardice, but through desperation and poor judgment. When leaders are under pressure to act, they sometimes choose the wrong solutions. When options are limited, they sometimes pick the least bad choice instead of waiting for better options. When resources are scarce, they sometimes waste them on programs that cannot succeed. Project LQ was not created by bad people. It was created by desperate people trying to save lives and stop an enemy that was winning. But desperation is not strategy. Pressure is not wisdom. Quick action is not always the right action. USS Atik and 141 American sailors died because someone decided that Q ships were the answer to the U-boat threat. They were not. The real answer was convoys, air patrols, radar, sonar, destroyer escorts, and time. Those solutions took longer to implement. They were less dramatic. They did not make headlines. But they worked. By the end of 1943, the U-boat threat was contained. By mid-1944, German submarines were being hunted and destroyed faster than Germany could build them. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, but USS Atik and her crew never saw that victory. They died in March 1942, 3 months into America's war, sailing a ship that never should have gone to sea, fighting an enemy with tactics that never should have been used. What worked against the U-boats was not clever deception or traps. What worked was systematic application of technology, tactics, and resources. Convoy escort became standard by mid-1942. Every merchant ship crossing the Atlantic sailed in organized groups protected by destroyers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes. The escorts were equipped with sonar, depth charges, and increasingly effective radar. They worked in coordinated teams, sharing information, covering each other's blind spots. When a U-boat attacked a convoy, it faced immediate counterattack from multiple ships. Air coverage extended farther and farther into the Atlantic as new long-range patrol aircraft entered service. The consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, modified for maritime patrol, could fly nearly 2,000 miles from base. These aircraft were equipped with radar that could detect surfaced submarines from miles away. They carried depth charges and could attack U-boats before the submarines even knew they were there. The so-called Atlantic Gap, the area in mid-ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, shrank month by month as new air bases were established in Greenland, Iceland, and the Azores. By late 1943, there was no gap. Every convoy had air cover throughout its entire passage. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant ship hulls, provided air cover even in the middle of the Atlantic. These carriers were exactly what Project LQ should have been. They looked like merchant ships. They sailed, with convoys. But instead of trying to trick U-boats into surface gun battles, they provided aircraft that could hunt submarines from above. The escort carriers worked. They sank U-boats. They protected convoys. They were worth every dollar invested in them. Technology improved rapidly. Sonar became more accurate. Depth charges became more powerful. Hedgehog and squid anti-submarine mortars could fire patterns of charges ahead of the attacking ship, increasing the chances of a hit. Radar improved to the point where it could detect periscopes and even submarine snorkels. Direction-finding equipment could locate U-boats by their radio transmissions. Code breaking became more sophisticated. By mid-1943, Allied intelligence was reading German naval communications regularly. Convoy routes were adjusted to avoid known U-boat concentrations. Task forces were dispatched to hunt U-boats whose positions had been revealed by decrypted messages. Training improved dramatically. New destroyer escort crews spent months in specialized schools learning anti-submarine tactics. They practiced attack runs. They studied U-boat behavior. They learned to work as teams. By 1944, American and British escort crews were highly skilled professionals who knew their business inside and out. Industrial production overwhelmed the German submarine force. American shipyards built Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. In 1942, the United States launched over 5 million tons of merchant shipping. In 1943, over 19 million tons. By 1944, the production rate exceeded anything the U-boats could possibly destroy. Even at the peak of their effectiveness in 1942, U-boats sank less than 8 million tons per year. The numbers were unsustainable for Germany. Perhaps most importantly, the Allies never gave up. When tactics failed, they tried new tactics. When technology proved inadequate, they developed better technology. When training was insufficient, they improved training. When resources were lacking, they built more resources. The war in the Atlantic was won through relentless, systematic improvement. Project LQ represented the opposite approach. It was a desperate gamble on an unproven concept. It relied on outdated tactics from World War I. It wasted resources that could have been used more effectively. It sent men to sea in ships that were not ready for combat, and when it failed, the program was quietly abandoned without learning the right lessons. The right lesson was not that Q ships could not work. The right lesson was that gimmicks do not win wars. Steady application of proven methods wins wars. Technology, training, resources, and determination win wars. USS Atik proved that lesson at the cost of 141 lives. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We work hard to bring you forgotten stories from World War II, the stories that textbooks skip, the missions that official histories ignore, the ships and sailors who served and died without recognition. These stories matter because they remind us that war is not just about the victories we celebrate. War is also about the failures we learn from, the mistakes we acknowledge, the lives lost in pursuit of solutions that did not work. USS Atik represents a painful truth. Sometimes courage is not enough. Sometimes determination is not enough. Sometimes even the best intentions lead to tragedy. The 141 men who sailed on USS Atik were brave. They knew the mission was dangerous. They went anyway. They deserved better than to die on a ship that was not ready, executing a plan that could not succeed, in a program that was cancelled 3 months after they were killed. Their names are carved on memorial walls, but their story was classified for decades. Most Americans have never heard of USS Atik. Most historians do not mention Project LQ. The program was an embarrassment, a failure, something the Navy wanted to forget. But forgetting failures means we risk repeating them. Remembering USS Atik means remembering that wars are won not by desperate gambles, but by careful planning, proper equipment, realistic tactics, and the willingness to admit when something is not working. The United States won the Battle of the Atlantic because the Navy eventually abandoned failed programs like Project LQ and focused on solutions that actually worked. That lesson cost 141 lives. We should not forget them. Thank you for watching, and please leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community includes history enthusiasts from every corner of the world, and we appreciate every single one of you.